how does that work? How do you put it on Facebook?
Zoom has like a relationship with Facebook that's what I'm doing right now. And it just syncs right in but we're still on the Zoom call, but it's linked on the Facebook Live.
Okay. Wow.
So we're actually live right now. So
it does.
Welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is Yurok and Talawa, and the executive director here at Two Feathers Native American Family Services. We are on our virtual Indigenous speaker series. We are located about 5.5 hours, for those of you that may be tuning in for the first time, north of San Francisco in beautiful Humboldt County. And we are also, I want to, before I turn it over to my colleague Shoshone and our wonderful guest today, we will honor and respect the Wiyot people. The land that I'm currently on is the land of the Wiyot people, and that's where Two Feathers is located. So I just want to pay honor and respect to the Wiyot people. And I want to turn it over to Shoshone before I introduce our guest today to welcome herself.
Hi, Ayukwi, Naknau Shoshone. Hi, my name is Shoshone Hostler, and I'm one of the mental health therapists here at Two Feathers. We're an ever-growing staff, and so that's been really exciting. And I'm really excited about the guest speaker today. I am on the Hupa Reservation, coming to you from my house. So I wanted to pay honor and name what the land that I'm on today as the Hupa Valley Indian Reservation.
Thank you, Shoshone. And so our speaker today is none other than Dr. D. Bigfoot. Dr. Bigfoot, I believe, in telling some of our staff before we got on, is one of the top Native psychologists, I think, the last 50 years, but maybe ever, in the sense of her publications and her impact in the field of psychology. And specifically, you know, she's a child psychologist, associate professor at the University of Oklahoma, directs the Native American programs at the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect at the University of Oklahoma. She's got a bunch of awards, one being she was invited to attend the White House Conference on Children's Mental Health. She's been very integral in helping Indian country borrow and adapt and implement trauma-informed care from a very indigenous perspective. And that's been a major part of her work that some in our community use the model that she helped create. And so with that, I just want to welcome Dr. Bigfoot. And how we're going to do this is she's going to share a presentation that she is, you know, she was the keynote speaker at the Society of Indian Psychologists. And this was one of her presentations that she did. And I thought it was fabulous. And I wanted our community to see it. So she's going to talk and kind of share that presentation. And then we'll have some question and answers. So welcome, Dr. Bigfoot.
I keep forgetting I put myself on mute. Thank you. Thank you. Lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me into your homes and into your community. And I hope that the things I share with you will be beneficial. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint slide presentation. And please feel free to oh, there it is. Ask questions or stop me or whatever might be helpful. Oops, I'm trying to bring this down a little bit so it's not in the way. Well, darn. Okay. The presentation is stories of our ancestors stepping into our identity and our sacredness. And it's really a way of thinking about ourselves and who we are as Native people. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and then what we're going to be doing today. As Dr. Moorhead said, this was a presentation that was done for the Society of Indian Psychologists annual convention back in June, and I'm happy to be able to present it again. It was a fun, thoughtful presentation to be able to share. Just as a correction, I'm a presidential professor, and the reason I want that correction is that as individuals in academia move through the ranks, being able to have promotions is really a key consideration of the work that they're doing. And so if there's anyone that would like, promotion letters or reviews or mentoring around promotions, then I really am open to helping and mentoring anyone in any discipline that would be beneficial to them. And having a presidential professorship is an important distinction that I can use to promote others. And I'm director of the Indian Country Child Trauma Center at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. I'm under the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. And the second aspect of this is that I'm not for sure how many are familiar with the SAMHSA funded Suicide Prevention Resource Center. On the 31st of August, which is coming up on Sunday, then I will be the director of the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, and very humbled by that award and the ability, the opportunity to address suicide within not only our tribal communities, but nationally as we work with states and other organizations to look at self-harm and suicide activities.
Dr. Bigfoot, actually, thanks for bringing that up. Two Feathers, we were awarded the Garrett Lee Smith Suicide Prevention 5-year project.
Congratulations. Well, hopefully we will be able to work together.
Yes.
So I just want to give you an overview because I think stories are so important. Stories are what we bring into how we share. Stories are what we have listened to, and the repetition of stories will be our future with our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. And I apologize, but I'm going to read some of this. I might have Shoshone help me with some of this if she doesn't mind as we move forward. As a culture, we are fortunate to have many kinds of stories. Stories contain the history, the hope, the explanation, the building of relationships, and many more ways for interactions. So it's really, stories are about relationships. Stories of our ancestors create the pathway for the next generation to view not only the past, but the anticipation of what the next generation can achieve. Our ancestral stories have been painful. We have gained much knowledge from what the present generation and past generations have experienced, and the ways of survival, but also the ways of resiliency. It is embracing the wisdom of the stories that allow this generation to know who they are and how they step into sacredness. This presentation will explore the stories of our ancestors and how to embrace sacredness when so much sorrow has filled our hearts. So we're going to look at exploring the use of stories in a therapeutic method, promote understanding of how identity builds resiliency and connectiveness, establish the use of Indigenous teachings as evidence that has stood the test of time in effectiveness and application. And I just want to say, so I'm more than happy to slow as we go through each of the slides. Just to let you know who I am, and I acknowledge that internet, my internet connection is unstable, it says, but we have different interactions that we have with different aspect of land and geography and history. So I'm of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma. The Caddoan Nation has always been attached to Oklahoma. I'm an enrolled tribal member. I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm an elder, I'm an auntie, I'm a gatherer in many different ways, not only of stories, but of people, of relationships, of knowledge. I'm a faith builder, so believing in, you know, the understanding of hope and promises of tomorrow, and a storyteller. I was fortunate, and I think that I'm not unusual. I don't think my circumstances were that unusual. It's certainly not in our tribal community, that I was raised with a great grandmother. That is, she was born in the 1870s, and many of her relatives that she grew up with were within that our same tribal community. Living on Shemame Road for a while, living in other places in Caddo County. And I think that many of us who have grandparents and great-grandparents, you know, that third and fourth generation within the home, that we have that history of being able to have their stories, or even have the stories of them being in the home and sharing those stories. So with my great-grandmother, who was Tenhu, she helped establish my cultural, spiritual, and professional identity that seeks this balance. And when we think about how that balance is and what that balance is, it's really about mental health or mental wellness. And it's not that you achieve it, but that you're always striving toward it. And there's always going to be things that are, you know, boulders in the pathway, but it's recognizing that those challenges create an opportunity that allows us to reveal ourselves to ourselves. And that by recognizing that we are stepping into sacredness each time we make these decisions, that we can come to know ourselves as well as love ourselves as our ancestors have loved us, because they prayed for us. They knew of our time and they wanted good things for us. So this is another one of my relatives, but as I think about my relatives and what has been given to me, my understandings of cultural application comes from the historical teachings of my family, of my community, of my faith, of my tribe. And especially, I want to recognize the teachings of the Tatista people or Cheyenne people. The Cheyenne people have been very generous with me, very kind, very giving, very embracing. And my first husband, Sammy Bigfoot, was enrolled at the Northern Cheyenne tribe. He died, and my second husband was Cheyenne Chief John L. Sipe, and he was a pipe carrier and a tribal historian for the Cheyenne Nation. And so the Cheyenne people have been, as I said, very gracious to me. And they asked me, they said, when you do presentations, when you acknowledge who you are. And so here we think about it, stepping into the sacredness, being acknowledged and bringing that acknowledgement with us. And the Cheyenne people have asked me to acknowledge them as part of the circle that I have around me. And as I think about that, that's again stepping into that sacredness. So I acknowledge them. My children are enrolled at the Northern Cheyenne Tribe of Montana. I also have to acknowledge my affiliation with my university, and everyone gets to acknowledge their university in different ways. I choose to acknowledge it with this, and I know that our season is going to be really different. I think 2020 has changed considerably, and the pandemic has hit us in different ways. So, however we can celebrate and find joy, then I think that that's an important part. as I went through my, um, formal education, one of the things I wanted to do was to always have a foundation was my cultural roots. And that with activities through work or, scheduling events that were professional related, I always involved my family. And that they were an intricate part of how things were demonstrated, how things were practiced, how things were rolled out in terms of being able to have a foundation for the next steps. And I think one of the greatest compliments my mother ever gave me, and I just want to acknowledge that in the year 2020, my mother turned 100 in June. So please remember and pray for her and think about that sacredness that has been in her life for 100 years. And I think the greatest compliment that my mother ever gave me was talking about going through, undergraduate. And it took me forever to get through my undergraduate program. It took me forever to get through my PhD program. And so my mom said, I don't understand. You took all those years of going to school only to teach how we lived every day. And I remember my mom telling somebody, she said, I don't know where my daughter got all this stuff about Indian stuff because it's just what we did. And so thinking about what we as a culture have been able to do is to place our children into this sacredness and to recognize them and uplift them. And it may not necessarily be seen as a big effort, and it may not necessarily be seen as something extraordinary, but it really is when we bring that understanding that we are placing children in the center of the circle and that we honor that circle, that's allowing them to know that they are sacred. So with that consistency, that predictability, letting them hear our prayers for them, our hopes and dreams for them, our understanding of how we got here with each preceding generation and how we're going forward with each preceding generation, that is just living a life that is, sort of the norm, but it really presents those safety and protective factors around each of those children. So I just wanted to let you see one of my granddaughters, because our children come to us with many different kinds of aspects of self. They have, different kinds of traits, different kind of personalities, and they can take on different kinds of personas, trying it out and finding joy in a variety of things. And so I think that that's one of the things that we can recognize is that our children, each generation can be a variety of things, and that we don't need to constrain them to just be or demonstrate in one thing. So as we surround them by the sacredness, that's the thing that's consistent. That's the thing, the telling of their story, the telling of, our stories, the telling of grandparents' stories, the telling of tribal stories, that can be the consistency that we can place our children in terms of being able to be in the center of that circle, and that they can explore who they are by taking on different kinds of roles and trying it out, but their identity remains firm when we have that consistency of sacredness. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we have this huge history that goes across this great turtle island, and it has not been without horrendous cost, and it hasn't been a very light journey. It's been a harsh journey. And so this is just capturing in a very simplistic way the things that have happened and where we might be able to go in terms of this next generation and going forward many generations. So we have our history, our pre-colonization, we had those circle of families, we had ceremonies, we had traditional practices of being a good relative. And, what is it that we pull through all of this when we think about the things that have impacted us, the colonization, the violence, the persecution, genocide, the dominance, the power and control, and how much has been eliminated in terms of the ways that trauma, grief, and loss was addressed, and what replaced that. And so as this new democracy was established, it had an impact on many things. So, the political coercion, the jurisdictional repression, economic and social oppression, psychological harm, the impact it had on elimination of resources, on social structure, on norms, on society, on our societal infrastructure that each tribe had. And then again, the immeasurable loss and grief, the re-traumatization with each generation. And then the lack of support for healing and resiliency that was not replaced. So as we think about what we were pulling through, this is where we were getting that impact, and where we had so many that were so profoundly affected that they did become lost, and they didn't recall the stories, and they were not told the stories. They were removed. They couldn't have that connection. They were cut off from being able to have that connection. They didn't know about their own sacredness. And so what we ended up with was a lot of inequalities. I'm not going to run through all of this, but certainly there was many kind of disparities that created family situations where children were not valued as they once were. And so as we moved into this, then we have this future where we're looking at self-governance, but not only self-governance in terms of tribe, but self-governance in terms of individuals. We're looking at the cultural restoration and what it means to actually have an understanding of healing and the healing process, to address the grief and the loss, and to understand what historical trauma is, and that the first steps of healing is grabbing the understanding of historical trauma. That's the very first step, that you cannot really move forward on that healing pathway without grabbing that historical trauma understanding. And how wonderful it is that Marie Braveheart Yellowhorse gave us the terminology and gave us a pathway that when we grabbed hold of the term historical trauma and grab hold of that concept, that we now are on that step forward with healing. So we have circles of families, we have ceremonies, and we now have a traditional way of thinking about being a good relative, and what that means, that as we pulled it all the way through the different generations of our past. And what we ended up with in terms of the losses and the impact is that American Indian people were punished. They were punished severely. Every time they fought back, something was taken away. And as we think about, the impact of what was taken away, there was a void, there was a gap, there was a hole, and shame became what was replaced. Shame filled that hole, shame filled that gap. And so as children was taken away, food, shelter, land, warmth, religion, spirituality, language, home, our teachings, our connections, shame became what was in place of all of that. And as we think about that, we have always been an honor-based society. We knew what shame was. We knew how to rectify shame. We used our ceremonies, we used our prayers, we used our gift giving, we used our cultural practices. We used all of those things to bring honor so that shame was not embedded in our culture. But when all those things were taken away, then shame became what we responded to. And so shame has replaced honor. Shame has become that pathway to adulthood. Shame has become our story. So as we think about what has historically been with us, honor is what moved us towards sacredness. When we honor one another, when we honor our ancestors, when we honor our children, our grandchildren, we acknowledge our own sacredness. When we apply our teachings, when we take those teachings, we honor our ancestors. When we use their stories, we honor our future because they tell us so much about what we can do as we move forward. So as we think about being this honor-based society, and this is to the heart of who I am. These are words not only spoken today, these are words that have been spoken by each previous generation. These are the understandings that our other generations prayed for us to have this knowledge, this understanding. And I grew up listening to words. I grew up listening to prayers. I grew up listening to tear-filled offerings. And so for me, tears are a way of honoring the words that were given to me. And tears are the way that I can pass on this sense of appreciation and acknowledgement. So as we think about an honor-based culture, an honor-based society that we are, it's the knowledge of Indigenous practices that are healing. It's the knowledge of Indigenous ways of explaining the world. It's the knowledge of Indigenous ways of explaining how things happen. It's the knowledge of Indigenous ways of explaining when to do, what to do when things don't go very well. It's the Indigenous knowledge of understanding transitions, of understanding ways of honor, and especially Indigenous ways of accepting that sacredness and to be humbled by it, but the willingness to accept it and to embrace it and to pass it on, to use that as a gift for the next generation, or the friend or the, the loved ones, that is a, it's a gift that keeps giving, that there's never an endless, it doesn't end, it's endless. So as we think about that, with this process, what we're doing is we're reclaiming our wisdom, we're reclaiming our traditional ways of healing that may have been lost or misplaced or distorted. As Indigenous people, we have always participated in ceremony to either prepare for an event or following an event in order to renew, recognize, acknowledge, purify, honor, transition, or stabilize. We acknowledge that we're spiritual beings. And as we think about what ceremony was about, it was this opportunity that when life was, in turmoil, that you use ceremony to bring that calmness, to bring that focus, to bring that understanding, to have those offerings so that that guidance could allow you to move on. And that, ceremony was used as Thanksgiving to, say thank you, to have gratitude, to offer a sacrifice. So what ceremony has always been, it's about healing. It's about self-regulation. It's about transitions. It's about sacredness. And even the small effort of offering someone water, that is healing. That's about self-regulation, because you get to take a deep breath, center yourself. It's about transition, because taking that, drink of water, and there's, water offerings have always been in many, many different tribal groups, that, to ground yourself in that water, and that thinking about what that gift is of water, then recognizing that sacredness of it. So even small ceremonies can be impactful. And so we still have that context within us, and within our tribal communities, and within our families. So as we think about where we are within our understanding and within our application, if you can just think of this particular slide as this blue circle as the world, and that we know that there's this great mystery that's out there that is things we can't explain. And that a lot of our indigenous ways of knowing came from that great mystery. Our indigenous knowledge can vary. We're have different aspects of it. And so this is just a few of them. So wisdom, reflection, beliefs, practices, relational, kinship, awareness. I mean, you can add many more things to that. And that as the basis of indigenous knowledge, and also, the rediscovery of it, and also the new understandings of it. So we were observers of stars. And what's really amazing is, I'm sure many, many, many tribes you have heard of, that we have been told that we are star people. And there's many different stories about, how different ones became star people, or the star boys, or there's all kinds of things about stars. And what we know now from science is that we're like 78% star material, actually the chemicals of stars. And so what was lore, seemingly lore in our tribal creation stories about star people, is actually reality. We are star people. So we were observers of stars, of planets, of animals, movement, ice, water, wind, earth, understandings of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. All of this came into being as we think about indigenous knowledge, and we're part of this blue planet that we live on. There's still that great mystery. And as we think about, this blue planet that we live on, there's still, to date, Western knowledge and knowledge of the world. And, I am very, very grateful for Western knowledge. I have been fortunate that I have, utilized Western knowledge greatly, and Western science. I want to share that I have 2 new knees. They're amazing. I walk. I have no pain whatsoever. I was, walking with difficulty. I had a cane eventually. I went to a wheelchair, and then was able to get, 1 new knee, and then another new knee. And now, I've walked up to 9, 10 miles a day with new knees. Not every day. I'm walking up to 10,000 steps a day right now. But I have, with my new knees, I have walked for, along the coast of Australia and other places that have been just amazing, which I would not have gotten to do without having, new knees. So replacement parts are great. Having a car that runs is great. So Western knowledge has a lot that we can benefit from. but Indigenous knowledge is still amongst us, and it's still being practiced, and it has stood the test of time. So Shoshone, can you name some images that are on this, our blue planet that we have there, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I see a canoe. I see the medicine wheel. I see a pipe, a feather fan, another feather. It looks like a medicine pouch, a sacred fire, some beautiful pottery and creation such as the rug. I see the planet and the stars, and I see fire, possibly another sacred pipe. And there are two images. They're a little bit small for me to be able to identify what those ones are.
Great. Well, there's a drum and
Yes, a drum.
but yes.
And oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, you did a great job. You named almost everyone. One of them is sweetgrass that you probably can't see. So thank you. You did a wonderful job. And all of these things are still currently being used. How old is stories about the moon and the stars? How old is the canoe or the pipe or the drum or, you know, use of sweetgrass or sweats or use of the medicine wheel? We have Indigenous knowledge that we still use today that has stood the test of time. So as we think about what we're bringing, this is my grandmother, Julie Edge. She was almost 98 years old when she passed on. And she used a lot of practice-based evidence. So as we think about what is practice-based evidence and evidence-based practice, and as tribal communities are wrestling with how to apply, I'd like to recognize that when we think about evidence-based practice, it is driven by theory. And then there's principles that are attached to those theories. When we look at what evidence-based practices are, for example, cognitive behavioral principles, they're actually driven by thinking, feeling, and doing. And thinking, feeling, and doing is not a new concept within our tribal communities. As I said earlier, all the things, how do you think a canoe came about? Did it just magically appear? Somebody thought about it. How do you think a drum came about? You think, you know, it didn't just evolve, you know, there was thought put into it and how to make it, or even a sweat lodge. So thinking is not new. Thinking is you know, as old as human beings. So by identifying a cognitive behavioral theory, that's a fairly new concept, fairly new articulation of a theory. But in our tribal communities, we have always had an understanding that we think, we feel, and we do things. When we think about, you know, some of our ceremonies like wiping of the tears or combing of the hair or wrapping of the cloth, all of those are about feelings. When we look at carvings or, you know, masks or whatever, they're full of different kind of emotions on those faces. And, you know, the actions or the doing of things, the behavior part of it. And, you know, from early on, shaping behavior has always been a part of our tribal communities' teachings. We know that because, you know, they used bird of prey for a long time. They trained dogs, and that when the Spaniards came and the horses were available, it didn't take tribal writers very long to shape horses to behave in certain ways. And they had war horses, and they had, horses for pulling travoises, or they had, there was different horses for different tasks. And so they shaped that behavior. So understanding how to think and how to do things and shaping behavior was not a new understanding that was brought into our tribal communities. Thinking, feeling, and doing has always been part of our knowledge base. And I think that the thing that we didn't do was claim to say, oh, this is ours. Because what we did was we said, this is a creator's. And therefore, spiritual connections was much more important because it brought all the thinking and the feeling, the doing together. So, individuals pushing a cognitive behavioral approach, it was that you can attach names to them. Whereas within our tribal communities, we didn't attach names because we felt like it belonged to the creator. When we look at attachment theory, and that's about, a lot of understanding about how to build that relationship. When we look in our tribal communities, relational connections are so important. We talk about, this is my auntie, this is my nephew, this is my grandma, this is my, grandpa, so the relational aspect of it has always been there. And that we recognize that the most harsh thing that we could do was to throw a relative away. That when we threw a relative away, when we banished them, that was the most harsh thing that you could do. And so attachment, we recognized, we knew that. We didn't have that term, but we knew about being good relatives. And having that understanding of that circle and placing individuals in that circle and recognize the sacredness of them. So that attachment has always been, historically there. Humanistic, when we say we're all related, not only, as human beings, but as, those four-legged ones, as two-legged ones. And I don't think that I'm unusual to hear the prayers of my, elders when they pray for things that were under the ground, on top of the ground, those things that were, surrounding us, those things in the trees, those things that flew, those things that were above, and all of our relationships, and that it wasn't just the animals and the birds and those things underneath and above, but it was also the rocks, it was also the water, it was also the wood, it was taking care of small things, even offerings for some spirits. I mean, so that understanding that we are all related, that we have an impact on each thing that we touch, and that we don't take things that might harm others in some way. So the concept of humanistic has always been an old teaching. Developmentally, we think about stages. And as we think about within our practice-based evidence, naming, getting a name at one time and being able to change that name over time. My son is 6th generation Ahanis, which means red-tailed hawk. And the Ahanis is actually little red-tailed hawk. And he's 30 years old with 2 little ones. And he says, I think it's time for me to change my name to something different. He said, because I'm not little red-tailed hawk anymore. And so, it's an understanding that people move forward around, and that there's different learnings that they take with them because they develop over time. And a real good example of this is the medicine wheel. If you know the teachings of the medicine wheel, it's very developmental. It's going progressively around that circle. And so we understood that. That was not a new understanding. Neurobiology, I always like to say, we knew the earth was round. We knew that we were not the center of the universe. And we understood the concreteness of what was here, but we also understood that there was a spiritual realm that we could have a lot of connection with. And that Scott Momanday talks about racial memories, that we could experience the understandings and the minuteness of our ancestors. And so I think a lot of times people say deja vu, but it's really being able to have that same experience that our ancestors had, or having that familiarity that our ancestors had. And that those racial memories are there and they've been passed on to us, and we pass them on to our children. And now we know with DNA that yes, things that happened in, generations ago are passed down, and good things can be passed down as well as bad things can be passed down. And we have an understanding of those racial memories, and that's part of the creation stories, and it's part of the teachings that we have always shared in terms of being able to explain why we know things that may not necessarily have a factual basis. And I think the empowerment, as we think about empowerment, this is a fairly new concept as we think about theory, but our understanding of being non-interference and non-judgmental about things, allowing people to make choices. And the thing with empowerment is that we can't empower other people. What we can do is create that environment that allows empowerment to be enhanced and to be embraced. And so as we think about that, as we think about that circle, as we think about stepping into sacredness, that's what we're talking about, except we don't call it empowerment, because power is a different kind of form. But when you step into sacredness, it's about being uplifted and you're whole and you become who you are. So this is one of the models that we developed from looking at an evidence-based practice, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy for children who have had trauma histories and symptomatic because of their trauma history. And the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is a particular approach. So we culturally enhanced it to honoring children, mending the circle, and created this well-being model as to how we were going to approach using these theories of TFCBT and moving it into honoring children, mending the circle. And so with a cognitive behavioral approach, of course, there's the thinking or the cognitive behavioral. And so we have down the mental and the physical. We also have emotional, spiritual, and relational. So this brings it so that it's more complete, that it's more encompassing. And TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, actually incorporates family. So, but it's not necessarily in the title. Whereas with ours, honoring children, mending the circle, it is embracing of it. So this is just an example of how we have brought evidence-based practice into a practice-based model. So as we think about, moving this forward, we're really thinking about the teachings of being that good relative, of being able to help individuals recognize what is therapeutic and how to focus on healing. So with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, as we enhanced it into honoring children, mending the circle, we talk about placing the individual in the center of the circle of care, being aware of the needs of the individual, being aware of trauma reactions, being aware of trauma triggers and reminders, understanding that flight, freeze, flee responses, being aware that traumatized individuals who are hypervigilant may appear antsy, cautious, searching, using avoidance or other ways that might be judged as suspicious behavior or hiding something, or maybe even said to minimize, situations or discount things. And so what we want to do is, as we look at this, is to provide predictability, consistency, and maintain expectations. Understand that the experience of trauma distorts the level of relationship building skills and the capability to manage that give and take of relationships in the best of ways. And so, what we want to do is help build those relationship skills, help build, being able to negotiate and have communication and being able to express what is the thoughts and feelings. And also recognizing that some coping methods may have worked well in prior situations, but may need to be reevaluated as the value of trust and safety increases. So this is how we're focusing in terms of, or this is the intent of focusing